Hello there, Mad Mike here, and welcome back to the channel. And today, I figured, since it's a slow news day, in honor of it being October with Halloween, I would do a list of my top 10 horror films of all time. Now, again, like some of my previous lists, I do have objective reasoning for why I like these movies, but it is my personal list. So if you disagree with some of the choices, that's your own prerogative. But if you have any thoughts, you can put them in the comments, obviously. But this is my personal list, and I'm going to go through each one of these movies and kind of give the reasons why I enjoy them from a horror aspect. Um, and we're going to start off with probably one of my favorite horror directors of all time, which is John Carpenter, and that is Halloween from 1978. Now, the things that I really like about this movie are, obviously John Carpenter, because I really do enjoy a lot of his directing. You will see at least one other movie of his on this list, maybe two. I can't remember if, certain ones because I'm reading the list right now, actually, that I just wrote because I have an absent mind. But the thing with Halloween is that it's very, very simplistic, and that's how Carpenter wanted to make it. It was basically a work for hire. He wasn't trying to do anything necessarily special with it. They basically just said that they wanted a movie about a man killing people in a small town and have it set around Halloween and have something involving babysitting. Because I believe the original working title for Halloween was The Babysitter Murders. And of course, you had Jamie Lee Curtis, who came in as Laurie Strode for that film and its sequel, Halloween 2, which came in 1982. And the thing is, Jamie Lee Curtis, again, this was her first movie, and she is such a great actress, and this is really what set her up as the Scream Queen. Obviously, she went on for Halloween 2, also Prom Night, and she came back for some of the Halloween sequels as well as the most recent one, and she's going to be in the sequel to it as well. So this movie sets up a lot of interesting things. It's kind of fun to hear like the behind the scenes stuff on Halloween, but even when you look at the film itself, nobody had really done what Halloween decided to do, and this is why this is the film that kind of jump started the slasher trend that would lead on into the 80s. And we'd had stuff like that before. We'd had stuff like Black Christmas in 1974, I believe it was. We had stuff like Psycho in 1960, which was kind of the prototype for the slasher film. But what Halloween did was it brought it to a whole new level where it made it seem like the killer was silent. He never said anything. He just kind of stalked around in different areas, and then they had those the misdirection scares, which were really, really good. And that's there's a few great ones. Like when he stabs the guy through the gut with the knife and pins him to the wall, and he's like up in the air. Stuff like that. But there is great misdirection in the film where Michael Myers is doing things, and people will say like, oh, it's a cat or something like that, like running out of an area, or they'll look and like, oh, it wasn't anything, and then as soon as the audience thinks like, oh, it's fine, it was a fake out, then he just comes in and starts murdering the shit out of people, and it's great. I love that movie. It has some of the best kills. One of the best ones actually is when he strangles the girl with the phone cord, because you see him standing in the doorway. He has the bed sheet over him, and he's wearing the dead boyfriend's glasses, so she thinks it's actually the dead boyfriend, and it's great because she's like talking to him, but obviously he's not actually talking. He's not talking back. She thinks it's some kind of a joke, and then she starts talking on the phone, and then he begins to start strangling her on the phone, and Laurie's on the other end, and she thinks that it's some kind of a joke where she's being fucked on the other end of the phone, but in reality she's being murdered. And there is a little bit of goofiness in it now that it's aged a bit. Some of the stuff like, when Laurie Strode finds some of the bodies in the house, they find one of the girls in the cupboard. I think it's the girl that actually gets strangled with the phone cord. They finds the girl in the cupboard, and she's like cross-eyed, like saying, yeah. And, it's kind of goofy a little bit when you watch it now, but if you're into the movie, you really don't even notice it. And also the other thing is the great story of Michael Myers, because Michael Myers has a very great origin story where he's this normal little kid until the day that he murders his older sister. And the first part of this movie, the POV shot where we're walking around the house as Michael Myers, and I think this is where Friday the 13th actually got this. Was that he's walking around the house. He's in the clown mask, and then we just see the knife and everything like that. There's very little blood in this movie too. It's very misdirectional. Even though this is a slasher film, we really wouldn't see a lot of the blood and gore special effects until Friday the 13th, 2 years later. With Tom Savini, because this movie really didn't do that a whole lot. It was mainly built around atmosphere. And a fun little side note: John Carpenter would go on to do The Thing in 1982, and the original The Thing from 1951 is playing on the TV in this movie, which is really really funny. But Halloween, I can't say enough good things about it. It sets so many high points for the slasher genre and jump started the entire slasher genre from the 70s all the way through the 80s, and it's such a great entry, and it's probably one of Carpenter's best works. And I'm so pleased that the newer films aren't treading on that and destroying it like some of the sequels did. But that's enough about that. That's my number 10. Number 9 is a film that I just mentioned a few minutes ago, which is Friday the 13th from 1980. And I will say this right now, even though the first Friday the 13th does not have Jason Voorhees in it, except at the very, very end and kind of a dream sequence thing, Friday the 13th is my favorite slasher series, period. It's my favorite slasher franchise. And I did this again, too, in a video I did before where I chronologically listed, my favorite movies in the series, of the 10 mainline series films. And I really, really enjoy kind of the aspect of it. The Tom Savini gore effects are great, and this is some very early Tom Savini work. He did work on the original, on the first 4 films in the series, and he really, even though it's very simplistic, it works for the film because it's very, very graphic. And like I said before, with what Halloween did, they did the whole scene at the beginning where Michael Myers is in the first person. In the sense of Friday the 13th, they did it for the off and on for the entire film, and it really, really works, because the thing is it makes you, the audience, view things as the killer. You are viewing these murders as if you are the one committing them. And it's so graphic and it's so strange. And the one scene that I will cite for this, and is the hitchhiker scene where there's the girl who's supposed to be a counselor at the camp, and I forget the circumstances that actually lead up to it, but basically she's hitchhiking. There's some kind of an issue. I think her car breaks down, and she gets picked up by this woman in a Jeep. Well, we know it's a woman later on, but we don't know it's a woman at the time. But this person in a Jeep, and she starts talking to them, and there's no dialogue back to her, which is a little strange, but they do it so that you don't get the twist at the end. And eventually the driver starts speeding up and speeding up and speeding up until this girl jumps out of the Jeep, and then she starts running through the woods. She's being chased by this person, and again, this is all in first person for the most part. There's a few little cutaways, like when she jumps out of the Jeep, it goes to third person, but she's running through the woods, and then it ends in spectacular fashion with a throat slitting. Again, Tom Savini gore effects, great gore effects. And of course, I can't mention Friday the 13th without mentioning the death of Kevin Bacon, where it's possibly one of the best slasher film kills in history, where Kevin Bacon has just, and again we play into the cliche a little bit, where Kevin Bacon has just had sex, and his girlfriend goes off to go clean up and do all that stuff, and he's just lying in the bed, and he's looking up at the ceiling, and we know from a previous shot that there's actually a corpse that's above him of another person who was killed earlier in the film. But he's lying there, and then a little bit of blood drips on him, and you're thinking like, oh, he's gonna find the body. He's gonna figure it out. He's gonna try and get his girlfriend. His girlfriend's gonna be murdered or something like that. And as soon as he kind of feels around and he realizes it, a hand comes up from underneath the bed, grabs his forehead to hold him in place, and then you see an arrowhead come up from under the bed and through his neck. And it is such a perfectly crafted kill scene. It is an amazing shot. Again, the special effects are top notch, and it's such a jarring moment because you're not expecting it. You're expecting like something to come from above, and then just suddenly something comes from under the bed and goes right through him. And it's a great scene. You also have Adrian King, who plays the the lead heroine or the survivor of the film, and of course Betsy Palmer, who plays Pamela Voorhees. Now, the other thing is very similar to Michael Myers, is the idea that Jason Voorhees has a very good origin story in the sense that, he's this kid that he drowns in Crystal Lake, and then 20 years later, all these murders start happening. But in the first film, obviously they don't go into the whole, Jason's the killer thing until part two. But in the first film, Betsy Palmer has some very good motivation for what she does, and the idea that she is this mother who is, grieving over the loss of her child, even though it's a mutant mongoloid looking thing, um, it's sympathetic in a way, even though you know what she's been doing throughout the entire film, and you don't expect that she is the killer because you don't see her for the entire film. You see her, I think, in the last 10 minutes of the film is when she actually shows up, and before that, I think most of the time it was actually Tom Savini or some or a stuntman or something like that, because you never see a face because everything is first person, and then the kills and stuff, maybe you see like a hand or something like that. Most of the time you don't see very much. So when you finally see her, you're like, who the hell is this? Like, you don't really expect it to happen, and then you slowly start to realize, oh, that's what's been happening. And it's a great heel turn at the end of that movie, where you finally get to understand, like, what's going on and why this person is out killing these people, and the motivation. Even though she's insane, you understand the motivation, and the movie ends with a spectacular decapitation. Again, I love Friday the 13th. It was a great starting off point, and the series only really got better from there in a lot of ways until it didn't. But I really do love this movie. It's one of my favorites. Now, we're going to move on to some other ones next. So number 8 is Stanley Kubrick's The Shining from 1980, and this is it's an adaptation of a Stephen King book. The only Stephen King book I think that I'm aware of that does not take place in Maine, and The Shining is an amazing testament to both the combination of Stephen King level horror and the genius of Stanley Kubrick, because this film combines the things that Kubrick is very good at, these very long, drawn out shots where not a lot is happening, but it's very atmospheric, and combining that with the setting and the ideas of the Stephen King novel. And there's a lot of really great stuff in this. There's some great scenes. The twins in the hallway scene is a really really amazing one where Danny, the young son, is riding his big wheel through the hallway, and there's no music, if I remember correctly, to the scene. There's just the sound of him riding the big wheel over the carpet, and all you do is you hear him riding through the hallway, and you see him going, and he takes a turn, and then he turns the other way and turns the other way, and then he turns one way, and you just see these two girls sitting in the hallway, and you don't know what's going on necessarily at this point. Because you know that there's something funny going on with the hotel, but you don't necessarily know like to what extent that funny is going on, or if it's all in Jack Nicholson's head, or like what's going on. But then you see these two girls, and they just go, "Come play with us, Danny," and it is so fucking creepy. And then they cut it in with these very strange shots of like the two girls having been brutally murdered and the entire hallway being spilled with blood, and it's so fucking weird. But the visuals are meant to make you uncomfortable with the scene. They're meant to make you think about horrible things like, oh my god, is that what's going to happen to him? Because again, the insinuation is that these girls are ghosts, period. That's not really an insinuation, but there's some kind of spirit. But then you see that shot and you're like, what the hell happened to them? Like, what happened in this scene where they just got, like, it looks like they got mauled by a wild animal. And then, because at the same time, you realize that Danny has also seen this. And he's horrified. It's a great scene. You have the stuff at the elevator filled with blood. Of course, you also have the whole the subplot line of the black caretaker there trying to make his way up to the hotel in the middle of the snowstorm to save the family because Jack Nicholson has gone as Jack Torrance has gone insane. And Jack Nicholson does a very good job in this movie at playing kind of a man who you understand has personal demons. but he still has his sanity, at least at the beginning of the film, and you get to slowly watch him degrade into madness. And there's a very great scene. I can't remember her name, but the woman that plays his wife, um, is she stumbles upon the typewriter that he's been typing his most recent book, because he's a writer, and she starts reading the pages that he's written. He has like a stack of pages, like almost a dictionary size stack of pages, and all it says is one sentence over and over again: all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. And it's the same sentence over and over and over again. And that's when she realizes that he's completely lost his mind, because she's afraid of him at this point for various reasons. And this is the point where she realizes, like, oh my god, he's actually gone crazy. And of course, as soon as we get to the realization of that, along with her, Jack Nicholson shows up in the scene. Do you like it? And it's so great because the voice comes from completely off screen. If you're watching it for the first time, you're not expecting it to happen. It's a huge jump. And then, of course, then he starts going on the rampage with the axe and stuff like that afterwards. But it's an amazing scene. The horror elements in it are subtle, but they work. The stuff with Jack Nicholson and the woman in the bathtub is another one that's it's very very scary when you watch it for the first time, because it's kind of the idea, like Jack Nicholson, because again the whole idea in the early part of the film is that you don't necessarily know if there are spirits in the house or if Jack Nicholson is just going nuts, and when you see the woman in the room, you think, oh, he's like fantasizing about somebody else besides his boring wife or something like that. And then he looks in the mirror and you just see the woman transform into this like grotesque, like decaying flesh, like not a zombie, but just like a just like a corpse, but not like a zombie corpse. You kind of know what I'm saying if you've seen the movie. It doesn't look like, it's not like a zombie. It's like a living corpse, which is a zombie, but you'd understand if you watch the film. Kind of what I'm getting at, but again, there's so many of those scenes in this that are kind of meant to make you uncomfortable, and Kubrick's style lends itself very well to this type of a dynamic because of the way he likes to draw those shots out to the point where they're almost uncomfortable. It does make the movie have a certain feel to it that is extremely unique. But now, going past The Shining, we're going to go to another horror, a brilliant horror film, which is David Cronenberg's The Fly. And I love The Fly. The Fly, keep in mind, this is the remake from 1984, if I remember correctly. And this movie was I mean, here's the thing. If you don't like body horror, you're not going to like The Fly. But I love body horror in certain scenarios if it's done correctly and if it's done by the right director. And Cronenberg is the right director to do body horror. He has made a living off of it. And The Fly is this amazing film that takes kind of this not maybe not goofy concept, kind of goofy, of the idea of an inventor who invents a teleportation pod, and a fly gets into the pod with him, and he exchanges body parts with the fly. That's what the original film was about. This has taken it to a point where they have fused on a genetic level, and it is an amazing idea that is executed perfectly. And this is what you have to do when you make a remake, is you have to kind of take the premise, and you have to turn everything else on its head and try and make it original in the execution. And that's what Cronenberg did. And Jeff Goldblum as Seth Brundle is an amazing character in this film, because he is so believable as this guy who's kind of this misunderstood genius. He's been working on this thing in private. He's kind of like, he models himself after Einstein, which you can see in various dialogue throughout the film. Stuff like, he wears the same clothes every day. She thinks that, like, oh, he just doesn't like wash his clothes, he's gross. But in reality, he's actually just has the same amount of clothes because he believed like Einstein that it was wasted thought to think about what you were going to wear for the day. And it was an element of vanity. So he's tried to model himself after some of the great minds of the early 20th century, which again makes sense given the character. And he makes this. The problem is that when he starts getting emotional, he makes breakthroughs, but ultimately, because he is emotionally inexperienced would be the right thing, because he's kind of I wouldn't say sheltered, but just his mind is so focused on his goal. He's kind of left the things in his life to the wayside, like having relationships and things. And the great thing about it is, as soon as he has this relationship with Gina Davis, they click, and Gina Davis has this very stocky, weird ex who I'm kind of glad gets his limbs melted at the end of the film, and he basically is trying to blackmail her and throughout various points of the film, and Seth Brundle gets confused at one point and thinks that she's cheating on him. And he decides to do the teleportation experiment by himself. And during that, the fly gets into the teleporter, and he is then fused with it, but he doesn't realize it until it's too late because it slowly starts to degrade his body. And this is where we get that great body horror by Cronenberg. Is it starts off very small. It's like, oh, I feel like $1 million, and he thinks it's because he was kind of, his body was almost purified through the process. He thinks that's what it was. But in reality, it's because his genetics are starting to change. And he develops, super strength, and he's more physically fit. He doesn't run out of energy as fast. He has this weird obsession with sugar, and it just keeps going and going from there. And then he starts getting these very strange hairs that are growing out of his back, and he starts developing he starts developing a very rancid smell coming off of his body, which is kind of like his flesh rotting off. And we go from that all the way to the point where his skin is bubbling, and he doesn't even look human by the middle part of the film. He just looks like a massive, like, wrinkly, messy flesh, basically. He doesn't even look like a person. And of course, by the end of the movie, the transformation is pretty much complete. But it's a great tragic story of somebody who was unable to who basically was a folly to their own ego to think that they could do this, but they did it without testing. They made it a rash emotional decision that ultimately wound up in their death and a bunch of very strange happenings in addition to that. And I will cite one of the scene in the movie that is just it's fucking disgusting and horrifying at the same time. So Gina Davis has become pregnant with his child, and they're not 100% certain if it was from before the teleporter experiment or from after the teleporter experiment, because they had sex before and after. So whether or not the child was conceived from which time period, they don't know. So she wants to get an abortion because she doesn't want to have a mutant fly baby, which is understandable. So the asshole ex-boyfriend takes her to a doctor to get an abortion, and there's a scene where basically they're going to try and do the abortion, and the doctor kind of backs away, and it's a very fucked up scene where you see that she has apparently given birth to what appears to be a maggot or a larva. And again, the special effects in this film are amazing. They really outdid themselves with this stuff. And there are even deleted scenes too of like a bunch of stuff, like him developing like a sixth or a fifth limb that like starts growing out of his side and stuff like that, which again, great stuff. And the things that they have in this are amazing. But it's also symbolic in certain ways, where Seth Brundle has he's transformed into kind of what he was, or what he was kind of modeling himself after, which is kind of like an emotionless, like very instinct. He's turning into like an instinct-driven animal, which is very interesting, because that's kind of the reasoning behind why he uses the teleporter in the first place, is because he just has this rash, knee-jerk reaction, almost like an animal. But Cronenberg does a great job at directing this. Gina Davis and Jeff Goldblum were both, I believe, married at the time when this movie came out. So there was great chemistry between those two. Ultimately, everything really worked very well for this movie, and I think this is really the movie that kind of launched Jeff Goldblum's career at that time, because he got a lot of work after that film. I think Earth Girls Were Easy was after that movie, and then of course obviously he went on and did a bunch of other movies in the 80s, the Body Snatchers film, and then in addition to that, oh no, Body Snatchers was the 70s, I stand corrected, and then in '93 of course he had Jurassic Park, but The Fly is an amazing film, and I couldn't recommend it higher as long as you're not too squeamish. Now, the next one is a classic, and it's one of those things like you have to be able to appreciate. If you're a true horror fan, you have to really be able to appreciate the black and white stuff to a certain extent. And the number six is Dracula, the original one from 1931 with Bela Lugosi. Now, the thing with this movie is that Dracula. It was obviously the original book was written by Bram Stoker. Stoker at the turn of the century, and then it was developed later on into a stage play. Now, this is not technically the first adaptation of Dracula. I believe that was Nosferatu, because I think that was an offshoot from it. I don't think that was originally done from a book, if I remember correctly. But this version became the more popular one, and this was the first one that was in. I think the Spanish one was a silent film, which is the one that came before this. But regardless, Bela Lugosi basically played Dracula on stage before being in the film, and he was the headliner. And the way that Bela Lugosi plays this character is amazing because it sets a precedent. It sets an amazing precedent for vampire films that come because everybody tried to copycat this after the fact because it was such a great performance, and it also set the idea for vampires for a very long time until there was kind of a deconstruction of the genre. And the idea is that the vampire is always inherently evil, but he's suave, he's deceptive. He's almost like the devil in a way, if you think of the devil from a biblical sense. Dracula is very much like that. Is that he has this ability to kind of persuasion. They have these very great scenes where they show that he looks into people's eyes, and they have these close-ups of Bela Lugosi giving like a death stare to somebody, and then he just makes them do what they want. He has this very great kind of presence where he waves his hand in front of their face and stuff like that. And he has this great cape. The early one of the early shots in the movie when Renfield goes to the castle in Transylvania to meet Dracula, and he goes into the castle. It's great because he talks to Dracula, and it seems like a kind of a relatively normal conversation to an extent. Even though you can tell it's very creepy, and obviously the atmosphere is very weird because of the castle and stuff. But Dracula, there's a great shot where Dracula, Bela Lugosi walks up the stairs, and they do it with cuts, and that's why I think it makes it so good, because obviously they couldn't do certain things back then. It was the early 1930s, but Dracula walks up the stairs, and then they cut away to Renfield, and I think the cutaway is that he's like watching him or something, or that he like turns away, or he's just sifting through something in his briefcase, and then you cut back, and there was this big spider web that was in front of Dracula on the stairway, and then you cut away and you cut back, and when you cut back, he's on the other side of the spider web. But there's no way that he could have gotten around the spider web without going through it. So in your mind, it's kind of a subtle thing. You might not catch it the first time you watch it, but it's an amazing kind of little thing that you see in that film. And the only thing that I can kind of say is that this film does a lot with alluding to things. If you don't really pay attention during this film, you might miss stuff because again, it's based off of a stage play. So because it's based off of a stage play, a lot of the stuff is like, oh, somebody looks out a window. There's a scene later on in the movie where somebody looks out a window and says, a wolf just ran across the front lawn, stuff like that, which is in England where they don't have wolves, or where wolves are not prominent, I guess. And it's stuff like that where you have to really pay attention to the story. And I will say this, that some of the other actors in the film are a little pedestrian. Van Helsing does a good job. I can't remember the actor that plays him, but really the one who steals the show is Bela Lugosi's Dracula, and that he is what makes it so terrifying because he's so very suave when he talks, and he plays the game essentially. If you wanna go to that extent, he plays the game with people where he can be this suave guy. He takes you out to the theater. He's kind of a ladies' man. He's very much this kind of like what women the idea of what women want. He's this mysterious guy who he can talk in ways that are very interesting. He seems like the kind of person that you'd want to go out with for an evening, even if you're just hanging around with him. He has some kind of the animal magnetism that he alludes in the film. And Bela Lugosi is able to do that very much. And again, you do have to take it in context with the time that it was made, because it's obviously times have changed quite a bit since 1931, but the idea is still there, and it's still executed very well in the film. And this is the film that really launched the Universal monster movies, because after this you had James Whale's film with Frankenstein in 1933. You had Bride of Frankenstein, and of course all the sequels to that. Then you also had Wolfman in the early 40s, Creature from the Black Lagoon, which came around in the 50s. But this was the launching point for all of those original Universal monster films, and it rightfully so, because it is a great story made out of a great play that was made out of a great book, with a great actor playing the lead of Dracula. But that's my number 6. Number 5, these next films are going to be films that I've kind of talked about before, but again, I'm just going to go in depth with them for the sake of the video because I really do enjoy them. Number 5 is Psycho, and Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, which came out in 1960, it's the prototype for modern slashers. And Hitchcock was so ahead of his time with this film, because it made the mold for slashers, and it took 20 years for it to catch on, basically. At least in full force. But the idea was that he made a relatively low-budget film. He made it in black and white in 1960, which he did not have to do, because you could have made films in color, but they made it in black and white so that they could get away with the ratings that they had, because if you showed too much blood and stuff like that at the time, they might rate it, the ratings board might have you cut more of it, and he didn't want to do that. It was made for a relatively low budget, and it was made with the crew from his television show, The Alfred Hitchcock Hour, which is basically like an anthology series of like scary stories and stuff. And it's so perfect because it's so simple. And the idea, and in addition to that, the actors that are in the film, like Anthony Perkins, who plays Norman Bates, who again embodies that role in that film. Very different from the book, but he embodied, well, I should say very, but somewhat different, very different in terms of his physical appearance. And Janet Leigh as Marion Crane. And it's such a movie. It's a movie that you don't expect to go in the direction that it goes when you watch it for the first time, because the whole early part of the film, you don't even meet Norman Bates until about 30 minutes into the film, and you don't know who he is. You just know that he's this guy who runs this motel, and his mother and him and his mother live in this house that's like up on a hill above the hotel, and his mother's kind of an overbearing bitch. That's the only thing you really know in the first few scenes that you meet him. Marion Crane, on the other hand, you've been following since the beginning of the film. You know that she's stolen some money from her employer, and that she's fleeing, and she's trying to get away from the law. And there's all these scenes where you think she's going to get caught. It's almost like it acts very much like a thriller in the first part of the film before it goes into the slasher elements. And again, you don't even meet Norman Bates until 30 minutes into the film, so you're just kind of like, who the hell is this guy? And then after that, you get to know Norman Bates, because probably about the 45-minute mark of the film, you have the huge twist where Marion Crane is brutally murdered, and you don't expect it to happen. It's one of those scenes where this is your protagonist. This is the character you're following for the whole film, and then suddenly she's just gone, and it's one of those moments where you're like, what just happened? And Hitchcock actually knew this, because he made it so that theaters would not let people into viewings of the film after the film had begun, because he didn't want people to come in during the movie and not understand what was happening. And theaters complied with that, surprisingly. Even back then, that was still a bit of a stretch, but it works for the film. It worked in the benefit for the film. And the scene in question, the scene where Marion Crane is murdered, I think it is possibly one of the best death scenes in horror film history, where it's been parodied a million times, it's been redone a million times, but that original set piece where you see that, there's two scenes in the movie that are really, really amazing. I'm going to go over this one and then the next one. but she's in the shower. You don't really expect she's very vulnerable. Obviously, when you're in the shower, you're very vulnerable. You're naked. You don't have any really way to defend yourself other than your fists or anything like that. And you don't really know what's happening until you watch the curtain behind her and you kind of see a silhouette in the doorway and you're not really sure what's going on. And then as soon as that shower curtain gets immediately yanked to the side and you start hearing those violins going, it is the most terrifyingly jumping moment for somebody that has never seen that film. Because as soon as that happens, she turns around, she screams, and then the knife just starts going and going and going. And if I remember correctly, there's over 100 different cuts in the following like 30 to 45 seconds where she is just being repeatedly stabbed. And it plays tricks with your eyes. And again, this is something that Hitchcock did very well in this, is that he never shows the knife actually go into the body. He never shows her actually get stabbed, but the motions and the jump cuts make you think that you're seeing the knife go in. And it's kind of like Halloween in that sense, where Halloween's essentially a very bloodless film in a lot of ways, and Psycho is that as well, because they go around it. And this is one of the ways that they went around it, where you just like there's so much, you just see the knife going up and down, up and down. You have the sound effect of the stabbing itself, where you just keep hearing it and hearing it, hearing it, and then that final shot of Marion Crane where she's collapsed over the edge of the tub. She's pulled the shower curtain down off of the rungs, and you have those close-ups too that are really good, where you see the shower curtain actually pop off the rungs, and she's just lying there and just staring at the camera. And it's such a moment where like it's almost like she looks like she's almost in shock, and it mirrors the audience, because it's the idea like, what did we just see? Because this is the character we've been following for the whole film, and now she's gone. Like, what happened? And it's a great scene. And then of course you get the twist reveal at the end of it, but you don't know what happened in that scene, because again, the killer is bathed in shadow the entire time and you never see their face. And then they leave and Norman just shows up and you assume that it was his mother that killed Marion Crane, even though we've been told that the mother is an invalid. And it's an extremely powerful scene. Now, the second one, which is actually my personal favorite in the film, is the death of Arbogast, who is the private investigator who was hired by Marion Crane's company to find her after she ran off with the money. Now, he shows up afterwards. He goes to investigate because he finds out that she stopped at this motel, and this is actually, I think, a jumpier scene, because even the Marion Crane one is unexpected, but you kind of expect something to happen. This one, you don't expect what actually does happen, and the way that it's filmed is very creepy. Where Arbogast goes into the Bates house, which is up on the hill. Norman Bates has gone off to do something, so Arbogast kind of sneaks in. He wants to go talk to the mother because he thinks that the mother knows something, and Norman won't let him talk to her. So he's sneaking in to try and talk to her. And you see him slowly go up the stairs. And it cuts back to these shots where you see the door to the mother's room and it's slightly open and there's a little light coming out of it. And as he's climbing the stairs, you're kind of like, what's going to happen here? Like, I don't know. Well, they're playing it very slow, so you expect like, okay, maybe Norman Bates is going to come through the bottom door or something like that, and scream at him or something like that. You don't necessarily expect what's going to happen, and then you just see this figure come out of the mother's room rapidly. It's within half a second almost, where she just comes out of the room, already has a knife, and then you just see the stab, and they don't show the knife actually go in, but they show that he has blood on his face, which I can't remember exactly where it shows that he may have been stabbed. I think it's somewhere in the upper chest or something like that. They actually used chocolate sauce, ironically, for the fake blood, because it showed up better on black and white. But he gets stabbed, and then you see the shot of him. You hear like what the sound of it is like. It looks like it sounds like his feet are like shuffling as he's falling down the stairs. But it's not like the classic fall down the stairs where he actually like falls backwards and rolls down the stairs and stuff like that. It's like he's like shuffling backwards down the stairs, and the camera is following him. He has his arms flailing and stuff like that, and then he finally hits the ground at the bottom of the stairs, and the mother has gotten to the bottom of the stairs at around the same time. So as soon as he hits the ground, she's above him, and all you see is this one shot of the knife up in the air, and then it goes down, and you hear a scream, and that's it. And he's gone, and you're like, oh my god. So because he is your second character that you've really been following for parts of this film, and he's gone now. And there's really only a few of them left besides Norman. And you're not actually 100% sure what's going on with Norman in general either, because he's apparently covering these things up, so you don't know what's going on. Of course, there is the twist at the end of the film where you find out what is going on. I'm not really going to give that away here, even though everybody's given it away before. And I may have given it away in the past, to be honest, but I love Psycho. Psycho was an amazing film. And now we're going to go to my number 4, which is the classic Wes Craven film, A Nightmare on Elm Street. And, of course, the film is starring Robert Englund as Freddy Krueger and Heather Langenkamp as Nancy. And Johnny Depp also shows up in this film as well as... God damn it, why can't I remember his damn name? Not Rod. Rod's the other kid. I'll remember it like halfway through explaining this film. But I love A Nightmare on Elm Street because out of those, they were really the big three in the 80s, kind of like they were the big three in the 40s. You know, in the 40s you had Dracula and Frankenstein and the Wolfman. That was like your big three monsters, and then you kind of had your offshoots like the Mummy and Creature from the Black Lagoon and stuff like that. But as far as the 80s go, your big three were Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, and Freddy Krueger. And Freddy Krueger made himself stand out amongst those three because he was the one that actually talked. And he would taunt people, and he would fuck with people, and it was great. And Robert Englund is amazing at doing that. You know, he's one of those... Him playing Freddy Krueger was like a match made in heaven because he is so terrifying, especially in that first film. That first film, he is legitimately fucking terrifying. And there's a lot of great scenes in that, and it combines kind of the best elements that Craven would go forward with, Wes Craven would go forward with in the future, of this idea of experimenting with bringing the genre to new levels, in the sense of, you know, you're experimenting with these fanciful ideas that, you know, obviously are not bound to reality, but at the same time you're putting these very realistic terms on them of, you know, people don't believe them. And it's kind of, it goes back to the idea of kind of when you're a kid, about when you tell, you know, adults things and they just don't believe you because you're a kid. But in this one it's different because the kids are actually being murdered. But Wes Craven does a great job at kind of doing the visual stuff here. And one thing that I love about this film is that you don't always know when you've crossed over into the dream realm, because again, the idea of the film is that Freddy Krueger kills you in your dreams. So when you go to sleep, that's when he gets you, and you have to sleep eventually. You can't live without sleep. So the idea is that he will get you eventually. So you go through that, but as the kids keep getting more and more tired, and they start falling asleep more, you don't necessarily know when the dream begins and when reality ends. And that's the great part about that first film. And there's a great scene with Heather Langenkamp where she kind of runs out of her classroom and she runs into this hall monitor, and you don't realize it at the very beginning but the hall monitor is wearing Freddy Krueger's classic, like, green and red sweater, and you don't realize it at the time, but she says, "Where's your hall pass?" And she says, "Screw your pass," and she runs away. And then you hear this other voice talk from behind her, and you turn around, and the hall monitor now has the Freddy glove and talking in Freddy's voice. And you're like, oh shit, she's in the dream. Oh, that was a good one. Because, like, that's the thing, is he screws with your sense of reality, and that's what this movie is really about, is even though you're not in reality, you can still die. And that's a great kind of way to frighten an audience. And there's a few different kills in the movie that are really really good. The first one, which is Tina, which again, this is kind of very similar to Psycho in the sense that really you're following Tina for the very early parts of the film. You know, you start off with her, you're in her original dream at the beginning of the film where it starts off when they show Freddy Krueger chasing her through the boiler room and stuff. But she's the first one to get killed off, and that sequence where she is in the room with her boyfriend Rod and she's in the bed and you see her actually physically levitate from the bed, and then the claw marks, and then she's just all over the ceiling. There's blood everywhere. It's a terrifying and messed up scene, and you're not 100. The best thing about doing really good horror, especially really good supernatural horror, is to make it believable. When like a person's face like turns into a demon or something like that, it's like, oh, that's like CGI. But back in the 80s, during that scene, you see her boyfriend in the scene, and then you see her on the fucking ceiling, bleeding everywhere and screaming, and you're wondering, how did they make that shot? Like, that is a perfect shot. And of course, if you watch the special effects stuff, you learn that it was like a rotating room and stuff like that. But when you're watching it in the theater, or if you're not really aware of certain special effects things, you're like, how the hell are they doing this? Like, where are the wires? How is she being held to the ceiling? And she's just being dragged up and she's screaming, and they show you the whole thing. It's not like there's not even a cutaway to somebody else. The only cutaway you have is when Johnny Depp and Heather Langenkamp rush to the door and they start banging on the door and stuff like that to try and come in. That's the only cutaway you get during that whole thing, and even then you're hearing her screaming through the door. It's an amazing shot. It's an amazing kill. It's a great way to kind of start off a film in terms of the level of graphic violence. And then of course Tina's whole her whole she shows up later in the film because Freddy uses her imagery to scare the hell out of Nancy, or Heather Langenkamp's character Nancy, and the other kids in the movie. Because there's a scene where Nancy comes across her and she's in the body bag. She's dead, obviously. She's in the body bag and standing up and talking to her, and then you see like a centipede come out of her mouth. It's horrifying, the imagery that Wes Craven gives you in this film. And again, I can't praise the special effects in this movie enough, because the Nightmare on Elm Street series has always had to have the heavy special effects because of the nature of the films and because of like what they deal with. So it's so amazing to see a lot of the special effects in this film, and especially the special effects involving Freddy Krueger himself and the look that he has. Again, the look is so iconic. The claw, the hand claw, again, something very original. It's not a butcher knife. It's not a machete. It's not a club or something some guy just picked up, or a chainsaw or anything like that. It's something that this guy made, that this sick fuck made to kill people. And it's so freaking it's so original, and it's so brutal when he uses it. And I think that's really why Freddy Krueger sticks out more than those other two in a lot of ways, is because he's so far removed from the world that they live in terms of the way that he operates. And I think that that's what makes Craven so terrifying, is that he's able to scare you in ways you didn't know you could be scared. And I think that's the sign of a great horror director, is doing that. And then Nightmare on Elm Street is a perfect example of it. So now we're going to move down to my number 3. And the top 3 on my list were really the ones that were locks for the most part. The other ones were all kind of interchangeable to some extent. But these are pretty much locks. And number 3 is The Exorcist from 1973. And I believe it's William Friedkin directed it, and William Peter Blatty wrote the book. And William Peter Blatty actually came back and directed Exorcist 3. But The Exorcist is it's a really, at the time when it came out, it was considered the scariest film ever made. And I can understand that 100%, because the end of this movie is just a complete like horror fest. The thing is like, I think some of the best horror films that have been made, or some of the best horror that is exhibited in this film, is because they spend the whole first part of the film kind of grounding everything, because you have the whole thing where you have all these subplots with these characters. It's a very character-driven film where you have this little girl named Regan, who's she starts playing with this Ouija board at the beginning of the film. Her mother's this actress. And she starts playing with this Ouija board, and then suddenly her demeanor starts changing. She starts swearing at people, very foul language and stuff like that, which again was very shocking at the time. Something that maybe isn't as shocking today. You can watch Kick-Ass and listen to Chloe Grace Moretz like freak the fuck out on screen and say stuff like motherfucker all the time. But at the time, it was very shocking. And you do have to compartmentalize in terms of, because the movie does have a lot of hype around it. But, they spend that first part grounding everything so well. And, the mother, doesn't know what's wrong. She thinks it's psychological. And then it starts getting worse and worse and worse to the point where the girl's talking in a different voice. And the elements of the film, she starts doing all these insane things. And then, at the same time, you have this concurrent story about this priest, Father Karras, who's he has his mother is elderly, and he takes care of her, and then they have this whole subplot where she's she has this fall in the subway and breaks her leg, and she has to go into physical therapy, and then she finds that she can't walk anymore, and she can't be in her apartment anymore because of the stairs and stuff like that. And basically, it's kind of this sad story for him where he's losing his faith during the course of the early parts of the film, until he's faced with this woman the Regan's mother, who comes to him and asks him for help because she's run through all these doctors. And again, this is something. It's not like what they do in modern horror, where it's like one scene is like, oh, we can't do anything for your daughter. It's not like the one scene where she meets with a doctor. There's so many scenes where she's meeting with doctors and therapists and people that are experts, and then she's run through the gauntlet of things to do to try and help her daughter. And then eventually they say, look, just go to the church. Like, it's the only thing left. We can't do anything for you. And eventually this leads down the path to exorcism. And they find out that essentially Regan has this spirit inside of her, or this demon that has manipulated her and done things. And there's some great shock value scenes in this film. The crucifix masturbation scene is a fucking shock value scene, and it is so utterly fucked up. I mean, the thing is, and again, I have to say this, the later parts of this film are fucking messed up if you want to actually watch it and like analyze it and break it down a little bit. Again, that crucifix scene where she's jamming a crucifix into her pussy and screaming, "Let Jesus fuck you." I'm sorry, there is you bring the holy water. Bring the holy water in buckets and start dumping it places. This is balls to the wall insane from what we saw at the beginning of the film. And then of course they have the head rotation stuff, they have the vomiting, the visuals of it where her skin is like cracking and changing. Actually, I think if I remember correctly, she's actually doing it to herself, which is they tie her to the bed so she can't actually mutilate herself anymore after the crucifix scene. And you see that she's developed this ability, this telepathic ability to try to like move things and open. She opens a drawer next to her bed when Father Karras is in the room, and she's able to lock the door and move a chair in front of the door to like lock her mother in there with her at one point after the crucifix scene. And there's so much stuff, and there's a murder that goes on in the background too that's completely unsolved. Where apparently they think that a man was in her room and his head was rotated 180 degrees around, his neck was broken, and he was thrown out a window, which is a foreshadowing to later on at the end of the film. And then of course we have the arrival of Max von Sydow at the end of the movie, where he's the elderly priest that comes in to perform the exorcism along with Father Karras. And the exorcism scene in this movie might be the creepiest shit I have ever seen in my entire life. Because it's just, they make it so believable. And again, if you invest in this movie from the very beginning and you sit down and you watch it, it's, by the end of the movie, you're like, I believe everything that just happened, because it's so grounded at the beginning that you feel like it's real. And then by the end of the movie, they get you to the point where you're like, I believe that that just happened. Like, again, that's what any kind of really good movie does to you, is it sucks you in to the point where you're invested so much in the story. I mean, obviously afterwards you can remove yourself and it's just a movie, whatever. But it does. They do a great job at that grounding element, and the special effects, again, like many of the other films I mentioned, were amazing. The pea soup scene is disgusting. You have obviously the makeup and stuff like that. I think it was Rick Baker that did the makeup on that, but I could be wrong. But again, it's just some great scenes in this thing, and this is really kind of the film that kicked off that sort of this is the crowning achievement of supernatural horror films in many ways, because people hadn't seen something like this before in 1973. They were used to the 50s movies of the giant monster movies and stuff like that. It's one of those things. I have a kind of a funny personal story about this where I love this movie. And I used to talk to my grandmother about it a lot because she was a very big movie person. And I remember that one of the things she always told me, she says, "I will never watch this movie because I actually believe it is evil." And this is coming from somebody that was actually alive when the movie came out. And it's that terrifying. Where even if she saw it on television, she would change the channel. And it's so it's so funny for me because I'm so into the horror films, or I'm so into horror films that it's not that shocking to me. The material, it's creepy. It's not overly shocking compared to some of the things that I've seen. I've sat through a Serbian film in Sallow, but it's just kind of funny seeing the visceral response that people actually had for it at the time, and that lasting response from somebody that I was talking to that was alive when it was out. But that's The Exorcist, and again, I can't stress the groundbreaking nature of that film. But let's move on to another one, which I think I've talked about on more than one occasion, and we will also be viewing on Halloween this year for Rated R Riffs, is John Carpenter's The Thing from 1982. And I can't say enough about this film. This is my favorite Carpenter film. To be honest, my 1 and 2 might be interchangeable depending on the day that you catch me on. But this film is amazing, and it goes kind of into the body horror department, a lot like Cronenberg, but not necessarily to the same extent. And this is this is a remake of a 1951 film called The Thing from Another World, but at the same time, it follows more closely to the source material, so it's a bit more close to the original story, which is a short story called Who Goes There, which I think was written in 1948. But the idea is that there's this Arctic research base, this U.S. Arctic research base, that this very strange event happens where this Norwegian helicopter is trying to kill this dog. Nobody really knows why. And again, this is the greatness of Carpenter, is establishing this mystery and then just throwing all insanity to the wind, or just throwing all logic to the wind and just showing you whatever the hell he wants. And I saw an interview that was really great with John Carpenter, where he said that he was talking to Stephen King, and Stephen King told him that the audience should never see the face of the devil. You should never show it. But if you could come up with something so shocking and so insane that if you didn't show it, it would be a travesty, then you have to do it. And that's what Carpenter did with this film. And he even stated himself that he went special effects crazy with this movie, and I love it. There's so many great scenes to this movie that I could probably spend the whole hour just talking about it by myself, or by itself. But Kurt Russell does a great job as MacReady. Childs, who's played by Keith David. A whole bunch of just random character actors that you see in a lot of other movies too that just show up in this film. Blair, who's played by Wilford Brimley. Diabetes. And honestly, all of these characters work so well in this movie. The paranoia and the way that this film feels, and also the score by Ennio Morricone is amazing. And for those of you who don't remember Ennio Morricone, he's also the guy that scored Clint Eastwood's Dollars trilogy for Sergio Leone. But Ennio Morricone does a great job at kind of scoring a movie that you really, really love, in terms of like the idea. He breeds paranoia, not just with the atmosphere, not just with the acting, but with the music as well. It keeps you on the edge of your seat. Like, I think I remember the first time when I watched this film, I was actually sweating when I was watching some of these scenes, because I was so ingrained. It was almost like a white knuckle type of feel where you're just so ingrained in the scenes. Um, because it goes from a point where you don't know what's happening to a point where you know what's happening, but you don't know what's going to happen next. And that is great. And there's two scenes that are really, really amazing in this movie. One is the defibrillator scene. Now, this is one that kind of gets set up early in the film, and if you watch the film multiple times, you kind of understand where it happens. But basically, this character called Knowles, who they set up earlier in the film as having chest pains. He's a bigger guy. During a scene, he starts to have what appears to be a heart attack, and so one of the doctors grabs a defibrillator. They put him on a table. They said his heart is not beating, so they try to defibrillate him. They defibrillate him a couple of times. His heart hasn't restarted yet, and on the third time trying to defibrillate him, when the doctor puts the defibrillator down on his chest, the chest opens up with teeth and rips his arms off, and then a giant spider-like being with Knowles' head explodes from his body as his real head detaches from his body and grows fucking spider legs. That scene alone is enough to make you shit your pants the first time you see it, because you are not fucking expecting that. And the actors do a great job of exemplifying the idea that they don't expect it either, because there's a great part, because the whole idea is that everybody thinks McCready is one of the things, so they're all trying to kill him, but he has like a flamethrower and stuff like that and some dynamite, and he says, I'll blow you all up. And as soon as that shit happens, he drops the flamethrower, which is literally the only thing that's keeping him alive at this point from everybody else ripping him to shreds. And he drops the flamethrower, the flame goes out, he doesn't know what to do. Everybody just kind of backs away, nobody knows what's going on. And there's actually a great scene too after he's burned the body of Knowles that's on the table and the head tries to get away. One of the other people looks behind, I can't remember the character's name. He looks behind him and he sees the spider head in the door. He says, "You gotta be fucking kidding!" And of course, Kurt Russell just turns around and sees it, and then just immediately lights it on fire, which is amazing. But the reaction feels so genuine. And then later on, that same character, which is the later scene where it's the blood test scene, which is justifiably infamous, is the scene where McCready is testing all the blood from the individuals to see who is the thing and who isn't. And if basically the idea is if the blood reacts to a hot needle in terms of if the blood explodes or something like that, you're not really sure what the hell is going to happen or if he's even doing anything that's gonna work. But in his head it works. But what we see is when he gets to a certain guy, the blood explodes out of the petri dish that he has and starts running across the floor, and then the dude turns into a giant walking fly trap and snatches up a dude's head and crushes it. And again, it's an amazing scene. I can't stress the special effects in this movie enough. The special effects guys for this film, they should be enshrined in their own honor because of the special effects, because this stuff is so good. You watch this movie and it all feels so real because it is. Because you're watching these actual things. They're physically there. It's not CGI. It's not shitty looking crappy CGI. It's something that's really there that you could, if you were on the set, you could reach out and fucking touch it. That's what makes it so scary, is that it's real, but it's so convincingly real in terms of the special effects being convincing. It's so convincing that is actually something that's happening, as opposed to just being a rubber mask or something. And again, the movie does a great job at just kind of exemplifying that. And really, the two elements that really make it so scary is that unpredictability and the paranoia of not knowing. And it sucks you into it in such a great degree. And of course, the ending is great, where you just have Kurt Russell and Keith David, and you don't know if one of them is a thing or not, and they leave it ambiguous at the end of the film, where they go away and you don't necessarily know what's going to happen next. Is Kurt Russell a thing now? Is why can't I got is Keith David a thing now? Now that there's just two of them left. If one of them's a thing, then the other one's dead. They have nothing left. And they just leave it off on that, and it's such a great ending. And again, I love the way the Carpenter presents the whole thing. I love the way that he does it. Again, with the elements of paranoia, with the insanity, with the way that all the characters kind of treat each other. It's such a great film. It's written very well. It's acted very well. And again, Kurt Russell does a great job in this film. But that's the thing, and now we're finally going to get to my number one, because I have been babbling here for a little over an hour now, and my number one is Ridley Scott's Alien from 1979. And some people are going to I know some people are going to say, "Oh, well, that's a science fiction film. That's not a horror film." Alien is a fucking horror film. If you've sat through Alien, you know it's a horror film. And Alien is a lot like The Thing in the sense that it is a movie that you combine all these really great actors. You got Sigourney Weaver, Tom Skerritt, Yaphet Kotto, uh, Ian I think it's Ian McDormand. No, no, I can't remember who. There's a whole bunch of really good character actors in this movie, and they all do a great job at their specific characters. And the thing with this movie again is that it builds everything up. Oh, and William Hurt too, by the way, because we can't forget him because of that scene. But it does a good job at kind of building up the terror, and you don't even really see the final alien until about I don't know, about 45 minutes into the movie. And again, it's the build up. It's the idea that okay, so there's these people, they're in space, they're on this mining vessel, this transportation vessel that they're transferring like minerals and stuff to Earth, and they're on their way, and they get this distress signal that wakes them out of their little cryo sleep. And when they get out of the cryo sleep, they have to land on this planet and find this ship where the distress signal is coming from. And it's kind of, I mean, the plot up until that point is kind of generic until you get to the ship. And the thing is that the visuals for this, and I have to say this, the aesthetics for this film are amazing. And the reason why I credit the aesthetics for this is because this is 2 years after Star Wars came out, and Star Wars in a lot of ways was kind of the clean sci-fi, I want to say, in terms of like, obviously the cleanest is kind of like Star Trek because of the the almost the sterileness of the environments. But Star Wars was kind of a little bit stepped down from that. It's kind of like the motel clean, and then you go to Alien, and Alien's like an alleyway clean compared to Star Wars, where if I remember correctly, I think Ridley Scott actually stated that they went to an aircraft graveyard, which is basically where they decommission and they chop up and dispose and recycle old airplanes. And they got all these airplane parts, and they literally just chopped them up and welded them to the walls on the inside of all the sets. So it has this very distinct, like, dark, kind of greasy feeling in all of these corridors and stuff like that. Everybody's sweating. There's liquid everywhere. There's condensation and stuff everywhere. There's only really a few small areas of the ship where you kind of feel like everything's sterile, like the sleeping room and like the eating area. Those are really the only areas that you feel like are kind of clean. Like everything that else besides that, it feels kind of dirty. And that goes a lot to the way of the movie, especially with the way that the alien actually looks, because he blends in very well with the environment as well. But they go to this planet, and William Hurt goes into this alien ship, and they find he finds this whole area where there's a bunch of eggs, and you don't really know what's going on. And again, I have to say the special effects for this, and you just see this thing pop up, this egg open, and you're like, oh, what the hell is this shit? And then that's when the facehugger comes out and attaches itself to him, and it goes through his mask, and you're not 100% sure what's going on. And this starts kind of Ridley Scott does a very good job in this, of kind of setting things up for later on in the film. And there's some stuff that doesn't get set up. There's some stuff that's just like, what the fuck just happened? But some of the stuff gets set up, like when they bring William Hurt back to the ship, and Ash, who's the scientist character, he lets him in, even though Sigourney Weaver is saying that, oh no, he has to stay outside for 24 hours because of the quarantine. He's a life form attached to him. We need to keep him in quarantine. We can't bring him in. Because of protocol. And this starts a whole thing where Ash basically is defying her, and he's kind of, I wouldn't say sucking up, but he's appealing to the Captain Dallas, and Dallas is listening to him despite Sigourney Weaver saying that's a bad idea. So basically he's winning over the captain and getting his way, and he's being wrong repeatedly. But this leads into the first big scene of the movie, and there's really two big scenes in this movie in terms of the way that it kind of works out. But the first one is the chestburster scene, which is my favorite scene in the entire film, and it's the most insane fucking thing I think that has ever been put to screen in terms of what the hell happens, because nobody expected that. Nobody. I'm telling every single person that went to see that thing in theaters, unless they had that movie spoiled for them, they were not expecting that to happen. And it's kind of funny because H.R. Geiger does the actual aesthetic work for the Alien. He drew the stuff. He won an Oscar for it, if I remember correctly, as well. But he did all the drawings and the conceptual art for the Alien. And they had this idea that the way to make male theater goers uncomfortable was to show oral rape in the film. And that's essentially what the alien does to him. Is the face hugger actually implanted an egg into his body, which then hatches inside of his body and needs to break out of his body, like hence like a chicken breaking out of an eggshell, except it's an alien blowing out of somebody's chest. And of course, John Hurt. See, here's the other thing: is the funny thing about that scene is that the actors did not realize exactly what was going to happen. John Hurt probably did, but most of the actors did not realize what exactly was going to happen in terms of that scene. I think they set everything up beforehand, and then they brought them in and they did the scene. But when the chestburster actually comes out of him, every single person in that room is showered in blood. Like, it's not even like John Hurt is all over the room. There's everything everywhere that you see. One of Lambert, one of the female, no, not Lambert, I can't remember who she is. One of the female crew members is like screaming and stuff like that. You feel like it's real because a lot of those reactions were genuine, and that's kind of a great thing about Ridley Scott and about really good directors in general, is they're able to get kind of these genuine reactions out of their actors. They're not. It's kind of funny, like, okay, that's really good acting. No, it's not acting. They're just really fucking freaked out. And you go through that scene and stuff like that. And then, of course, the alien leaves, and that leads to another really good scene involving Harry Dean Stanton, who's another character in the film, and actor who plays another character in the film, and there's a great scene in the engine room where and this is another really great kind of what the fuck scene where, they're looking, when you first see the alien when it comes out of John Hurt, it's this little like white thing, and it just kind of goes, and then it like scurries off into the shadows, and like everybody's kind of like, oh, what the fuck just happened? And so now they're looking for it, but they think they're looking for something small. They think they're looking for something like the size of a house cat. And Harry Dean Stanton wanders into this like little mechanical room area, and he's looking for the cat, who's called Jonesy. And another thing, like, it's kind of funny, like the whole thing with the cat too. It's like, okay, now you have a cat on a spaceship. I don't know why. But he's looking for the cat, and then you see this huge thing just drop down from the ceiling. It grabs him, and you realize at that point, like, the alien has septupled in size in the course of what we assume to be maybe just a couple of hours. And it just grabs him, and then that's when you see the whole thing where it has the second, the tongue that has its own mouth and stuff like that. And the imagery of the alien is so goddamn creepy the first time you see it, especially because it's just like, it has no eyes. The only features that you can really see on it is the mouth. It's so bizarre the way it is, because it doesn't seem, it seems almost like a machine, but it's not. And then of course the whole thing with the acid blood and everything. But that is such a horrible scene. And then it drags Harry Dean Stanton up, and then he's just gone. And then you just see a shower of blood come down as Sigourney Weaver and Yaphet Kotto run in to try and find him. I think it's Yaphet Kotto. It might be Dallas, I can't remember. But the other really big scene in that is the scene involving the Dallas winding his way through the duct system. Because the whole idea that they have now, that they realize the creature is as big as it is they want to try and force it into the airlock and blow it out into space. So the only way to do that is, since they know it's using the air ducts, they want to try and close some of the air ducts, go in with flamethrowers, and force it into an area where they can airlock it away and blow it into space. So they're tracking Dallas, who's played by Tom Skerritt, through these ductwork, and at the same time, they're also trying to track the alien with these little tracking devices they've developed. So this is possibly one of the best jump scares I've ever seen in film, and it's set up so perfectly where they're tracking Dallas. So Dallas, they're like, okay, the creature is here, so go here. The creature is here, so go here. And Dallas is just going through, and all he has is this flamethrower. Keep that in mind. And so it's the scene. He drops down. He's in this tunnel. They're saying like, you need to get out of there now. You need to get out of there now. The alien's closing in on you. You don't see anything. And he's looking back and forth through the tunnels, and you don't see anything. So you're like, what's going on here? So then he drops down one level. He goes down this little ladder into another air duct that's below that, and the behind him is bathed in darkness, and you see nothing. And again, that's a great job, I think, by the lighting people in that scene, because you see nothing behind him, and all you see is the flame from the flamethrower in front of him. It's illuminating him, but it's not illuminating anything behind him. And then he turns, and as soon as he turns, you see the alien is immediately behind him, and then all you see is the thing stretch out its arms very quickly, and you hear kind of what sounds like an inaudible scream or a screech or something like that, and then everything cuts off and they lose contact with them. And it's like, oh, and keep in mind, you don't even see anything in the scene, but it is so jarring because you're not expecting something to be there. You're expecting it to, like, pop out in front of him, or maybe like grab him from below or something like that, or maybe it's above him now or something like that. You don't expect it to be behind him during that scene, and as soon as you turn, you immediately jump. And that scene gets me almost every time I watch that movie, but I love that scene. It is so amazingly done. It's perfectly done by Ridley Scott. The timing of it, the acting of it, the way that the guy in the suit, that's another thing. The guy that is in that alien suit, I can't remember his damn name, but the guy that's in the alien suit for that, he is an amazing actor, because he does such a good job at kind of portraying that, even though that suit was probably the most uncomfortable thing that man ever had to wear, because I think the skull part of it weighed like 40 pounds or something, and it was completely lopsided because of the weight differentials. It's a great physical acting job by him, because in the scenes where you see the alien, it barely even seems human. The way it doesn't seem, I shouldn't say because it's not human, but it doesn't seem, even though there's a human in it, it doesn't move like a person. And the way that they edit it, you don't really see it in a full shot very often because of the limitations of the special effects. But when you do see it, it's terrifying because of just the way that it moves and the way that it looks, and the things that are happening to people in the scenes. And it's such an amazing movie. And again, I can't stress it enough. I love Ridley Scott. He's one of my favorite directors, period, regardless of horror or anything else. But this is my favorite horror movie of all time. I love Alien to death. It's, again, I prefer it actually over the sequel, even though I do love both of them. But this movie it's so claustrophobic. It's so tension. The tension, the surprises, the claustrophobia, the not knowing about certain things. Again, it shares a lot of similarities in terms of the way that it operates with The Thing in certain ways. Because again, it's kind of a monster movie in a sense. But that's my number one. But and if you've listened to me droll on about film this long, thank you very much. But I want to know what your top 10 horror movies are. Put them in the comments. Again, I like to know what you're thinking. Make sure to hit the bell for notifications, hit the like button, subscribe, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?